I've been interested in steam for a long time. The first time I really met what was the Surrey Hills Live Steamers in those days was at an exhibition which was at the exhibition building, and I was one of the public hanging over the rails and watching with great interest because I was already building a small steam train, a titch, and in 1953 I felt that it was good enough to go to Stan Milligan and was invited to his home in Mont Albert Road, and my wife and I and small engine went over and we found Stan's track. Now Stan's track was a circular track in his backyard. It was about 5 metres radius, which is about 36 metres round, and I've read in one of his articles that they reckon that 6 miles an hour or 10 kilometres an hour was a pretty fair speed, and I think it was a pretty fair speed around a small track. The chief requirement to be a member was that you had built your own locomotive and had shown that it could be made to work. If you couldn't do that, you couldn't be a full member. You could be an associate member, and there were plenty of associate members, some who were building their locomotives, others we called photographic members. They came with their cameras and not much else. But that changed later on. We found it to be too restrictive, and our membership is not restricted that way anymore. Well, the membership was growing larger. It was becoming too large to house in the backyard. And also people were building what we thought were big locomotives, such as 3.5-inch gauge Britannias, and they really didn't like backyard tracks very much. And 5-inch gauge with bigger locomotives was becoming popular. So we started to look for two things. One was a club track, so we'd have our own grounds, and the other was a larger track. Bert Jones was one of the great hunters for land. He was able to drive around during the week and he scouted out blocks of land that he thought might be appropriate. And finally, after much searching and looking around, we came upon this block of swamp in Rowans Rd, Moorabbin. There was no Rowans Rd in those days. All there was an open paddock and a wet patch of ground. And we arranged finally with the Moorabbin City Council to lease an area of land there. The first track at Moorabbin was a single loop, an elevated track but level. We hadn't at that stage dug out cuttings and tunnels, so we had just a circular track, and that was in use for quite a while because the earthworks required were quite extensive. As I said, the land was originally a swamp. It had to be filled. There's about 4 feet of filling, I think, over most of that land. Well, we went on to improve that area, and I think the first structure other than the track was a wooden footbridge, and that was built to get across the elevated track so that we didn't have people being skittled by trains as they came round the corner. Well, later on we went on to dig our tunnel. That required some very extensive concrete works for the tunnel because our road vehicles cross over that, and that's a very solid piece of concrete. The digging of the cutting was not easy because it wasn't easy to put it quite where we wanted to have it. We actually had it machine dug partly, but then we had to move it sideways a certain distance, which required an awful lot of work. There were working bees to lay the concrete base on which the track sits. Railways, of course, require signalling, and part of our society, part of the membership is interested in signalling, and they slowly worked towards having a proper brick signal box built. And I think that was the next structure to be built. And that's, in those days, at the top of the signal box you could overlook the whole ground. There was no trees in the way and no clubhouse to get in your way, so you could survey the whole site looking down from the signal box. We used to meet in a double-sized tin garage, and that was very hot in the summer and very cold in the winter. And even then, with our garage, sometimes we couldn't close the doors to get the number of members in, and those at the back either froze or roasted according to the weather. That clubhouse is still there. The present coal shed is part of the original clubhouse. Anyway, we went ahead to plan and build the clubhouse which we have at present. Being on filled land, it was quite complicated to get foundations. Ken Grills was our leader in building. The members worked to dig and pour the slab for the building, and everybody who could help was in on the assorted labouring, including lifting the roof into place. With the elevated track finished, we had what we were sure, and still are sure, was probably the best elevated track in Australia. and many of us enjoyed to drive our locomotives fast and furiously around that, and also to haul the publics more sedately at time. Some people got tired of going round and round in circles, and they thought that they would rather have a railway than an elevated track. Now, a railway implied that you could have points and sidings, and some of our members in particular were interested in trying to replicate the Victorian railways, and that included their signalling and their locomotives and their rolling stock. So from this came a drive to build a ground level track. The ground level track is quite limited because it sits inside the elevated track, but in the limited space available we've got a very interesting layout of 2.5 circles of track and a very complete shunting yard which has its own turntable. Now that was a big labour again. It was done by the usual hard workers in the club and was just finished in time for another convention. Now conventions are always interesting because at some of our conventions we've had around about 100 locomotives on the ground, and that's a lot of people. They've come from as far as West Australia and Queensland. As we do in our turn, we go to visit them. The opening day of our elevated track was the 19th of September 1970, and you'll find that written on the plaque set in the track, and you'll see here some photographs of the mayor riding for the grand opening ceremony of our track. And I don't think we've looked back since 1970. After we'd built the elevated track, we were looking for things to make our mark on the countryside, and one of the things we have there is the full-size signal which came from around Hyatt Station. That again was quite a job to not only have it delivered there but to get it erected by a team of manpower. You sometimes get great respect for the builders of railways when you try and copy their jobs. The big wheel itself, of course, is an R-class driving wheel. That's about 6 feet in diameter. I believe it weighs about a tonne. It was delivered lying flat, and again we had a trial to put it up on edge but found it far too heavy for us. And Bill Stokes was the man. He was in charge of disposal of railway surplus material. He was the man that arranged to have that wheel got for us. So there's our big R-class wheel. Later on we built a steel portable track, and that's been taken to many places. After you've done a bit of portable track work, you get very tired of moving it around, setting it up, taking it down again for the afternoon. The steel portable track is the basis of the small loop which runs around the big wheel at the front of our club grounds. It was put there and welded together permanently. One of the differences between our elevated track and our ground level track is the way in which the track is constructed. The elevated track is all steel and it's welded and sitting on concrete bricks, but the ground level is laid more or less as a full-size track is. It's on wooden sleepers, and the sleepers are set in ballast being loose stone, of course. The track is steel bar set on edge, and it sits in mill slots in the sleepers. Some of our members got together to make a machine which would slot the sleepers. And there was one enormous day when some members of the club went up country to pick up red gum for sleepers and brought home a big load of sleepers, some of which we still have. But that's all been put together by pushing individual sleepers on. This has got the advantage that you can track circuit, and so the signalman can get a warning that parts of the track are obstructed by trains on them, and the point work is interlocked so that you can't change points under a train because of the electrical interlocking. The actual points, I think Neville Levin was one of the designers of the point work, and the point work was made off-site and brought along and installed, and the track was then brought around to meet it. There's a lot of work in the points that go to make our Petticoat Junction, which really is a very complicated piece of track work which gives us the choice of a number of movements. I think the designers of that part of the track are to be congratulated. It stood up well to years of use, and the traffic variation allowed is quite remarkable. The club has always been a mixture of people with actually very few engineers in it. Stan himself had an electrical engineering background. I'm not quite sure of what sort, but he was the engineer of 3UZ. That was his job when I knew him in the 1950s. Dr. Orr was a doctor, I'm a dentist. We had train drivers, some engineers. I think you name the job, we've had them. It's one of the strong points of the club. If you want someone to do a job, there's nearly always some specialist available to do it. I'm talking to Richard Berryman, and his father showed the progress of our railway club. He started off with a 3.5-inch gauge Juliet, which was, by modern standards, a very small engine. Fortunately, we got him diverted to that before he went to 2.5-inch gauge. But he went from there to make a 3.5-inch gauge R-class, and that was getting too big for a backyard. And then he went on to 5-inch gauge and built firstly his Simplex and then his Springbok. And when you go from 3.5-inch gauge to 5-inch, you roughly double the weight of your engine, so it becomes quite a job to move it around. People have been building model steam locomotives for almost as long as there have been steam locomotives to model. And so if you go back to the 1860s, you can find quite good scale models, apart from the toys that were also available. Over the years, sizes became standardised, and by the 1930s, 2.5-inch gauge was the popular size for small locomotives. If you were rich, of course, you could have something much bigger. You could have 7.25 inch, or if you were very rich, you could have 15-inch gauge locomotives. But if you weren't that rich, you could build a 2.5-inch gauge locomotive. And they were built to approximately 1/24th full size. Now, when a little more money came around and people wanted something a little larger, they moved to 3.5-inch track, and that was 1/16th of the full size. Or as we say, or used to say, 3/4 of an inch equals 1 foot. And there again, where people got a little tired of those, they became too small, and they went to the next size. Well, the next size probably should have been 4 3/4, but it became standardised at 5-inch. And the 5-inch track is probably the most common in use around Australia and Great Britain, and that's about 1/12th of full size. When we think of people that have built numbers of locomotives, Bill Newman was probably the most prolific locomotive builder that I know. He started in 2.5 and went through 3.5 up to 5-inch, and some of his locos are still running in the club, others have been sold away, but he was a great builder. Fred Pascoe was another character. Again, he started in 3.5-inch locomotives, and he had 2 Atlantics that he used to double head with. It's not a bad effort to double head 2 large 3.5-inch locomotives. But Fred went from there to build the General. The General was a South African locomotive, and being, of course, to 3'6" gauge, when you put it on 5-inch track, it became a very large locomotive. As I describe it, it's about as big as I am, and it was rather frightening to be riding on his track with a small engine and hear his big engine pounding up behind you, chuff, 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 chuff. He also built a very popular locomotive, the Mallet, the locomotive with a hinge in the middle, and we've used that a great deal on our elevated track. Did an enormous amount of public hauling, firstly in Fred's hands and then later owned by Neil Allen, and finally I think it became pretty well worn out and was sold to South Australia, where it was rebuilt and is still in use. That was a very attractive engine to drive and to watch. I think about the only time I can remember driving it, I managed to break the water glass with a shovel. Laurie Jordan was a great runner on public days. We hope to see his loco again soon, but he again has a 3'6" gauge prototype, this Currabee Central, and it's called Bluey because it is blue. And Laurie drove that so many times around the circle in one direction, he finally wore one of the tyres out, so he's had to have his front drivers retired. But a very useful locomotive in public days. Another big blue locomotive was Dr. Orr's Pacific, and we didn't see that very much at our club grounds, but we certainly enjoyed driving it at his home. And shortly before he died, he moved his home track up to Kyneton, and we had a club run up there one day, enjoyed his locomotive. Alan Jones has been around a long time. Again, like all of us, we don't attend every meeting and sometimes we have some years off. But Alan was a great driver, firstly with his PV Baker and then his Britannia. And Britannia is back running as well as ever, and we're very pleased to see Alan running. David Hempel was an engineer by training, but not a locomotive engineer. And he started off by building in 3.5-inch gauge an R-class locomotive. It was slightly smaller scale than the ones that we're used to seeing because he made it to scale to 5'3" gauge, whereas the present ones are made slightly different. That was a good locomotive, and then he built his 3-cylinder S-class. We all like to see that run because it ran consistently and well and had a very beautiful steam whistle. If you could hear it, a chime whistle. And David has now gone to Queensland and has built one more, even better locomotive since he went to Queensland. Some of our members like to build Victorian Railways locomotives. In the larger locomotives on 5-inch gauge, Nev Levin's J-class, Alan McCaskill N-class, some electric box locos, in particular Nev Owen's very beautifully painted E-class, and we've also got a couple of B-class diesels. One is owned by David Newman and the other one, which is not yet quite completed, belongs to Nev Levin. So there's plenty of Victorian Railways locomotives to look at. It's very pleasing to see not only grandchildren but some of the younger men that have come, and a few young ladies too that have come to join in our club. And as long as young people keep coming, the club will survive. The ladies, of course, also support us on our club days. They come along and bring afternoon tea and look after us. They also support us on public days where they run the canteen, which provides a little useful income for us. But I think the real thing is that our wives support us personally. I think that's really the important part. We do enjoy our monthly meetings, and following that day we always have a club run, and I think perhaps that's the best day of the month when we get together, steam our locomotives, show how good they are, and if they're not quite so good, we hide them away quickly. We also have days when we're open to the public. On the first Sunday of the month we open to the public, and judging by the people that attend, we are very popular, and we get children of all age from 9 months to about 90 years, all wanting to ride our trains. We also have the occasional day where we either run for charity or for some organisation such as the Neighbourhood Watch. These days are days of community service. When we look around our grounds, some particular parts of the structures bring back memories to us. Bert Jones on his gardening and his fountain, Sid McComb, who designed and did most of the building, I think, of the steel bridge. Peter Gray made our Victorian Railway trestle bridge. When I say made, he was the instigator and chief construction man. Ken Grills I've mentioned as being very much in hand for the clubhouse. It's not only our club area it's improved, of course. The council have beautified the area around us, and opposite we have playing fields and the little athletics. That's a very nice part of Moorabbin. Our club membership is a little over 100, and we're not all locomotive builders. Some of us like to build, some of us like to run, some like to do both of those things. But other people have really quite different interests, and we have, fortunately, people who are interested in signalling, who are good at electronics. We find that some builders build locomotives quickly to run and wear them out and throw them away, and others spend many years producing a truly scale model with very, very nice detail. It's not easy to know where new members come from. As I said, I was introduced to this group by going to an exhibition in the exhibition building. many years ago. So it's important that we do have a public profile. We do this by supporting things like the AMRA exhibition at Camberwell. We've had shows in the local library. In the past we've done outings with portable tracks. Our club is also reported in various magazines such as the Model Engineer and Live Steam, and possibly people learn from there. They also learn just by driving past our block or coming into a public day. So perhaps the big things we look back at are getting land of our own, building our first elevated track, having our clubhouse, and most recently our ground level track. And I think they're all achievements that we can be well proud of.